So I've got the strip of interfacing and I've finished off both the edges of the skirt, and they're now laying right sides together. The next step is to do a row of basting stitches down here, which will then press flat before we insert the zip. So for this I use a contrasting coloured thread. I've got a pink one here so that you can see the stitching easily. Also, you don't want to finish off at the beginning or on the end. You want the biggest machine stitch length that you've got and leaving the ends unfinished so that we can pull it out quite easily at the next step. It needs to be a seam that's about ½ an inch longer than the zip tape, because when the zip's sewn in we'll position it a little bit lower here to allow for the hem, and you can't sew right to the bottom of an invisible zip, so we'll want that to finish a little bit earlier. So basically we're sewing a seam down here, big stitch length that's about 8½ inches long in a contrast thread. I'll just pop in a couple of pins and then head over to the machine. First up, I'm going to change my stitch length to the biggest one it can be on this machine, which is 5.0. I'm then going to use a 1 inch seam allowance so that there's plenty of room for my zip to sit nicely in the seam. So the edge here is on 1 inch. Pop the needle in. I've got my contrast thread so I can see it easily for the next step. I'm not going to do a reverse stitch, I'm simply going to move down from the top of the skirt to my final pin, which is at 8½ inches depth. And then I'm not going to reverse, but I'm going to leave a little excess thread there. Next, I'm going to put my matching thread into the machine. I'm going to reduce the stitch length back to 3, and I'm going to sew from just beneath where this stitching has started here, this time securing it with a reverse stitch, down the rest of the seam of the skirt. I'm actually going to stop about 9 inches from the bottom because I want to have a split at the back of my skirt to make it a little easier to wear. If not, if you don't want a split in the back, then you would sew from here, reverse stitch all the way down and reverse at the end, and then we press this entire seam open, which is the only time we can get into to press it all really well, and then we insert the zip up at the top. I've pressed the centre back seam of the skirt all the way down so that it's nice and flat. If I lift this up here, you can see this is the basting stitch in the contrast colour, and this is where the regular stitch begins. Now I'm going to take my zip tape, and with the right side of it facing down with this line matching the seam line here, I'm going to position it in place. The zip needs to finish below the basting stitch here, and it needs to sit between 6/8 of an inch and an inch from the top edge of the skirt, so that later on I've still got room to turn this over and hem it. So I'm going to position that like that, and then I'm going to pin it in place. Now that the zip is pinned in place onto the central seam line, you can baste it down both sides so that it doesn't shift when you machine it in, and actually these stitches can stay in place afterwards, so if you make them reasonably neat there's no need to take them out. The key thing to remember is that you're only sewing to the seam allowance here, you're not going through to the front of the skirt. So if you start at the bottom here, then you can do reasonably big stitches, but some nice tension on there so that they're secure, and work your way along both sides to secure the zip. Be able to open up this gap, so you can just go in and easily, because these are big stitches, you can easily take these out, revealing the zip underneath. You can just work your way along. And then what we'll do is, once we've got down as far as we can go, we'll go to the machine now to secure this in place with the machine stitch. I have put the zipper foot onto my machine, and I've also moved the needle to the left hand position. This is the back of the skirt with the zip tacked in place. So I'm going to open this up flat, so there's just the seam allowance underneath. And what you need to do, you don't need an invisible zipper foot at all, you just need to roll the tape back a little bit and position the needle close to the tape, like so, and then go very slowly. I've got a machine stitch length of 3, and I'm going to move very slowly down here, rolling the tape back as I go and stitching close to it. Do a little reverse stitch at the top to secure the zip, and then working my way along. Obviously the zip's open, so I don't have to worry about hitting the head of the zip tape until I've got nearly to the bottom as far as I can go. Just rolling it back each time. I find this much easier than using an invisible zip foot, because I can see the needle and where it's at. I'll keep going. When I feel like I'm not going to be able to go much further because I'm coming to the bulk of the zip head, then I simply do a reverse stitch there and finish off. What you can then do is cut the threads and move back in, and where that stitching finished above the zip head, you can just move out further, close to where your basting stitches were here, and then just machine down there and reverse to secure the bottom of the zip tape as well. So a reverse stitch past the zip head and down to the bottom. Never sew across the bottom of a zip because it's nicely secured in place as it is, and you don't want to create a bump on the outside of the skirt. So that's now secure from the right side. Can just have a little test. So you can see that I've machined this side in, and next I'm going to go and machine the other side in, but it's sitting. To sew down the other side of the zip, I've switched my zip foot over and put my needle back to center so it's on the right hand side, and I'm just repeating the process, but this time instead of rolling the zip tape out towards the left, I'm rolling it towards the right. But otherwise it's just repeating exactly the same process all the way down to the bottom. So it's all done. You can see here that the zip is invisible as we want. It's also really nice and flat here. You don't have to press it because it was pressed before the zip went in. If you pull here, see it goes up and down with no problem. Beneath the zip is already secured to the seam going down to the split, and there's a nice distance left here at the top which can be then turned under once you've attached the skirt to the apron front.